We're coming to you this week from Columbus Circle in New York City. In our show this week, we have an impressive lineup of New Yorkers from the world of religion, academia, civil rights, and also business. We begin Washington Watch with a conversation with Dick Parsons, a man well known in the banking area, but also he's the man who was CEO of Time Warner and chairman of the board, who also built this impressive building here, One Time Warner Place. Dick Parsons, first of all, welcome to TV One's Washington Watch.
Nice to be with you, Roland.
From your perspective, how have you judged where we are as a nation in terms of our economy? Are we actually growing? Are we actually getting better?
Yeah. Well, at least you didn't say I was one of the folks that caused it. I thought that's where you were going. I was like, ooh. You know, it's interesting. Things are getting better. The problem is they're just getting better slowly. But you can feel it if you move around the country. Mm-hmm. The restaurants, I always, you know, it's funny, when I was a banker, I had the restaurant index. I always would walk around town and see if the restaurants were full or not, because that was an indication of whether people thought they had disposable income. The restaurants are filling back up, the stores are showing modest improvements year over year, same-store sales, cars are moving again. Things are beginning to click over. But the rate of growth isn't what, you know, we, a nation of impatient people, would like to see.
You talk about when you were a banker. I mean, you've had a long, distinguished career in banking. When you hear folks say banks are too big to fail, that there's no way we can repeat that course again, do you agree with that sentiment? And if yes or even no, what is the recipe to deal with this whole debate? Because you go out there and people, when you say banks, they tighten up and are upset.
Trust me, if I had one public servant or public policy maker tell me back when I was chairman of Citi, Dick, you don't understand, the people are angry with the banks. If I had one of them tell me that, I had 1,000 tell me that. People are angry with the banks because they believe that the banks caused the collapse, and they were resentful of the need to sort of step in with taxpayer dollars and bail the banks out. So it's understandable. The question of too big to fail is a very complicated one. These banks, the global banks, you know, the so-called, you know, systemically significant financial institutions, they didn't get to the size they are simply because somebody back in headquarters sort of sat back and said, I think bigger is better. They got to the size and complexity they are because that's what the marketplace was calling for. The banks are basically responsive to what their customers need. And so as business globalizes, and as companies doing business now in 110, 115, 120 different countries around the world, they need banks that can follow them and bank them and help them in local markets. So the banks just became global as well, which has made them much larger and much more complicated entities. So simply to say that, well, you know, too big to fail, we got to break these banks up, that's running in the wrong direction as far as what the marketplace wants and needs and will ultimately get.
Well, should there, though, be some constraints?
There should be. Probably, you know, we can't go back to sort of, my opinion, Glass-Steagall days where you sort of simply say, you know, the banks are simply sort of deposit takers and lenders to businesses and consumers, and everything else is outside the banking system. But there needs to be both an increase, probably, and this has been the trend in the capitalization of banks, so that the banks are sitting on more of their own money at risk than heretofore. There needs to be a rethink about the regulatory structure that looks at banks. It really needs to be global, because the banks are global. And then there need to be clearer methods. The real problem was when all the banks were threatened with going down, we had no formula, no program, no pilots, no knowledge about how to disassemble them piece by piece and move risk out of the system. This is something the government's been working on now. What do you do with a big bank that gets in trouble, other than come in and pump money in to keep it alive? How do you take it down piece by piece? So, as I said, it's a complicated problem. People are working on it.
You've had to deal with multiple presidents. You are reading your information, Republican. You work with president. You work with Democrats. Your assessment of President Barack Obama, job he has done, and If you're sitting before him in the Oval Office and saying, Mr. President, you have 4 years. This is what I think you should really be focusing on.
Well, I'll start with the easier part of the question, my assessment of President Obama. I know him. I think of him, we're not really friends, but sort of as a pal. I've done some work with him in various of the councils and advisory things he set up. He's enormously bright, and he's a gifted communicator, and he has a vision, I think, of the future that I can associate with. I think his challenge has come with, how do you, in a highly partisan time like we live in, how do you get things done in Washington? I can imagine sometimes when I go to sleep at night what the combination of Barack Obama and Lyndon Baines Johnson would look like. Because while President Johnson wasn't necessarily, as they used to say in Texas, the sharpest tool in the shed, and I don't know that he had a vision that is comparable to the vision that Barack Obama came into office with. He was a master at getting things done in Washington, right?
Period.
Kicking ass and taking names. And that's, I think, where this president has struggled a bit in terms of how do you make it work when things are even more polarized than they were in Johnson's time.
Should African Americans be making demands of the president and in Congress?
All citizens should be. African Americans are citizens, and they have not only an agenda. I mean, it's easy to think of it, as kind of an African American agenda. I think of it as an American agenda. Bob Johnson, formerly of BET, just ran some polls about the state of Black America. How do Black people feel about their situation? And he was telling me he was surprised because 50% said, well, things aren't much better, but they're not much worse. And about 20 to 30% said things are better for them than they were in the past. But the 20 to 30% for whom things are worse, they're much, much worse.
Right.
And there is some cohesion to this notion of a middle class, of people finding common ground and common sense of their own destiny with each other. If you get to a place where you have way rich people over here and way poor people over there, the system will break. And the challenge, and it's particularly a challenge in the Black community, is how do we reach out to and bring particularly the urban disadvantaged along, so they feel like they're part of the system. They feel like they're part of the society. They don't feel like a land apart. Because if that doesn't happen, ultimately, this thing's going to break.